The rain fell in a fine mist, clinging to the stone facades of the old town of Avienne, where cobblestone streets curled like ivy through crooked rows of ivy-draped houses. Gaslights flickered softly against the evening fog, casting golden halos that danced on slick pavement. A bell chimed gently from the ancient clock tower nestled in the town square, its tones softened by the weather and distance. Lena Marrow, wrapped in a pale gray coat and carrying a well-worn satchel, crossed the courtyard slowly, her boots tapping rhythmically on the stones. She liked the quiet after the shops had closed, when the scent of bread and lavender lingered in the air but the crowds had vanished. The florist's window still glowed faintly, with a single bouquet of bluebells left behind in the display. She paused, eyes drawn to the delicate petals pressed against the glass. Bluebells, her mother's favorite. It made her think of the garden behind the house she'd grown up in, a place half surrendered to nature and always full of bees. She reached into her coat and withdrew a key on a long ribbon, her fingers lingering on the cool brass. A flicker of hesitation passed through her before she tucked the key away again. She wasn't going back tonight. Instead, she turned down the alley behind the bookshop, its windows dark but smelling faintly of old pages and ink. The sky above her was a deep violet now, stars barely winking into view behind drifting clouds. The air carried a hint of salt, this close to the cliffs, the sea was always whispering just beyond the edge of the world. When Lena reached the end of the alley, she emerged into the quiet square behind St. Viril's chapel. A man sat there on the stone bench beneath the hawthorn tree, sketchbook in his lap, completely still except for the movement of his hand across the paper. She stopped in surprise, about to slip back into the shadows, but he looked up before she could. Dark eyes, shadowed by long lashes and the brim of his hat, met hers. "Evening," he said softly, voice low and calm. She hesitated. "Evening," she replied, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "I didn't think anyone else came out here." "Not many do." He set the pencil down and tilted the book slightly, glancing down at his work. "It's the quiet I like." Lena moved forward a few steps, curiosity tugging at her. "What are you drawing?" He smiled, just the corner of his mouth lifting. "Nothing impressive. Just what I see." She stepped closer now, peering over his shoulder. A half-finished sketch of the chapel bloomed on the page, shaded with delicate, precise lines. The hawthorn tree beside it had been rendered in fine detail, every twist of branch and bud carefully considered. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Thanks," he said, then glanced sideways at her. "You come here often?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I can't sleep." He nodded like that made sense. "Same." They stood in silence a moment, the wind nudging the hawthorn's branches and setting its leaves to trembling. Lena looked at him properly then, at the curve of his cheek, the ink-stained smudge on his thumb, the way he sat like he belonged to the bench and the moment and nothing else. He looked content in a way she'd forgotten people could be. "I'm Lena," she said. "Elian," he replied. They didn't shake hands. They just looked at each other, a thread drawn between them by name alone. And then, as though the air had agreed they needed no more words, they sat, Lena at the other end of the bench, her fingers folding and unfolding in her lap, and Elian returning to his sketching. The silence between them felt full instead of empty, like the space beneath a cathedral dome. Neither of them said another word before the rain stopped and the stars came out. When the mist finally lifted, revealing a silver moon scattered with clouds, Lena rose first, brushing a bit of moisture from the hem of her coat. Elian glanced up from his sketchbook, the pencil stilled between his fingers. "I should go," she said, not quite looking at him. "Will you come again?" he asked, quietly. The question lingered in the air, more delicate than the wind. She paused, half turned away, and then gave him a slow, honest nod. Yes. That was how it began. Over the following weeks, Lena returned to the chapel square night after night. It became a silent pact, unspoken but unbroken. Sometimes Elian was already there when she arrived, sometimes he came after. They never planned it, never arranged a time. Yet somehow, they always met beneath the hawthorn tree when the stars began to rise. The weather grew warmer, slowly, and spring crept over Avienne like a song in a forgotten language. Tulips bloomed near the fountain. The cobblestones warmed under sunlight that lingered into the early evening. And each night, Lena and Elian filled the quiet with their presence. Some nights, they talked. Elian spoke of the coast where he'd grown up, farther north, where the sea was colder and wilder, where gulls screamed over jagged cliffs. He told her he'd been an architect once, before he lost the taste for blueprints and deadlines and the walls he was always told to build. "I like sketches," he said once. "They're honest. They don't pretend permanence." Lena didn't speak much of herself. Not at first. But over time, in fragments, she gave him pieces. "I used to play cello," she told him one evening, her voice soft as seafoam. "Until I stopped." "Why'd you stop?" She had stared at the chapel then, her eyes distant. "Sometimes the silence is louder." He had nodded as though he understood. One evening, as May threatened to turn into June, Elian brought a second pencil. It was a small thing. A gesture wrapped in quiet kindness, and he held it out without a word. Lena blinked at it. "I haven't drawn in years." He tilted his head slightly. "Doesn't matter." And so she took it, tentatively, and let herself make lines across an empty page. They were uneven, uncertain, but they were hers. She drew the fountain, the curl of a stray vine, the shadow of a bell. They didn't talk much that night, but when Lena left, she carried the sketch with her. She didn't look at it until she was home, tucked under the attic beams of her little house where dust glowed like motes of gold in the moonlight. When she finally unfolded the page, her chest swelled unexpectedly. It wasn't perfect. It was real. Their rhythm continued, like the tide, each night a slow current that carried them closer. There was no rush, no declarations. Just glances that held a second too long, a brush of fingers when passing a pencil, a laugh shared at something mundane that suddenly seemed significant. One night in mid-June, Lena arrived early. She sat beneath the hawthorn tree, a tiny bouquet of bluebells beside her. The sky was painted in shades of lilac and rose, the scent of salt on the breeze. Elian arrived moments later, pausing when he saw her. His eyes flicked to the flowers, then back to her. "For you," she said simply, offering them. He took them without hesitation, touching the petals like something sacred. "Thank you." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "Do you ever wish we could pause time?" He smiled, but there was sadness at the edge of it. "Sometimes. But only when it's already running out." The word struck a chord in her chest, a low ache she hadn't expected. "Is it?" "Not yet," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But the world always asks for more than it gives." They didn't speak after that. They simply sat until the stars came and the bluebells wilted in the heat of his palm. It was in early July when Lena noticed it. Elian's sketches were growing softer, lines fading even as he drew them. He blinked more often, rubbed at his temples, and his hands trembled sometimes, just enough for her to see it when he reached for his pencil. She didn't ask at first. She was afraid of the answer. But one night, when the wind turned and the chapel bells rang long past their hour, she spoke. "Elian," she said quietly, "are you sick?" He looked at her for a long moment. And then he gave the smallest of nods. "Something with the blood," he murmured. "They've given it a name I don't care to remember." Lena's breath caught, her hands clenching in her lap. "How long?" He looked away. "They said I might see autumn." The silence was a weight between them now, too heavy to bear gently. Lena's voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because this place, with you, it's been the only part of me not marked by it. I wanted something untouched. Even if it was only for a while." Her heart broke in the quietest way. Not loud, not sudden. But like ice cracking beneath the surface of a still lake. And yet she did not cry. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. And in that moment, Elian closed his eyes. Letting her hold him. Letting her know. The following days melted into one another, slow as honey and just as golden. Lena came every evening still, only now she brought thermoses of tea, a blanket folded under her arm, and books she'd long forgotten she loved. Elian smiled more now, not because he was getting better, but because he stopped pretending he wasn't fading. She read aloud to him sometimes, her voice threading through the square like silk, passages from travelogues, myths and folk tales, the occasional poem. He listened with his head tilted, eyes closed, fingers resting in hers. Occasionally he would murmur a thought, an opinion on a line, a memory the words stirred, and then fall quiet again, content to drift with her voice as the tide. Their drawing slowed. Fewer sketches were finished, more pages left blank. But Lena didn't mind. It was never about what they made, it was what they were making, a space where time bent, softened, gave them more of itself than it gave others. One night, lightning flickered far on the horizon, silent and distant, illuminating the chapel and its spire in soft, trembling pulses. Lena sat with her head resting against Elian's shoulder, his coat smelling faintly of ink and salt. "I dreamed of you," he whispered. She stirred slightly. "When?" "Before we met. I think I dreamed of you every night for a year." His hand found hers. "I just didn't know your name." Lena didn't speak. Her throat felt too full. Instead, she reached up and pressed her fingers to the line of his jaw, memorizing the shape of him. "Tell me," she said, "how you'd draw me." Elian's lips curved faintly, even as his breath came shallower. With sea-colored eyes that never stop searching, with hands that remember music even when they don't play it, and hair that never falls the same way twice. He turned to her slightly. "And I'd never finish it. Because I'd always want one more line." The wind brushed over them gently. The hawthorn tree dropped its first pale berries like tiny stars at their feet. The first time Elian didn't come, Lena waited for hours. She sat beneath the tree with the sketchbook open on her lap, the pencil gripped tightly in her hand, and stared at the chapel as the evening deepened and the square emptied. She counted the bell tolls, marked the wind's sighs, and listened for footsteps that never arrived. Eventually, she went home. The sketchbook lay open beside her all night, untouched. He didn't return the next night either. Or the one after that. On the fourth day, Lena went to the address he'd once scribbled for her on a loose page torn from his book. A little row house on the East Hill, small and crooked, with roses growing wild through the railing. A neighbor saw her knock and came over with a quiet expression. "Are you a friend?" the woman asked. Lena nodded mutely. "He asked for no hospital," the woman said. "Didn't want anything done. Said he wanted the sky to be the last ceiling he knew." Her voice was kind. That made it worse. Lena didn't speak. She simply stepped past her and went inside. The house smelled like charcoal, and sea air, and rosemary. The sketchbooks were stacked by the windowsill, dozens of them, some closed, others left open mid-page. Lena walked slowly through the rooms. The place felt like a whisper, nothing loud, nothing broken. Just fading color. Like watercolors left in the rain. She found a single note, folded on the kitchen table. Her name written in Elian's hand across the front. Lena. I always knew the silence would come again. You taught me it didn't have to be empty. Don't look for permanence, my love. Look for the unfinished things. They are always reaching forward. Wherever I am now, it is because of you. E. She folded the note with shaking fingers. Held it to her chest. And wept. A week passed before she returned to the chapel square. The hawthorn tree had dropped more fruit. The bench was slick with dew. The sketchbook still lay where she had left it, the pages curled slightly from rain. She sat down. Opened it. And began to draw. Not the chapel. Not the square. But him. Line by line. Slowly. Tenderly. With the care of someone remembering a dream as it fades. She stayed until dawn, the sun rising in soft ribbons of gold and lavender. And when she stood to leave, she looked down at the sketch and smiled. It wasn't finished. She would come back tomorrow. And keep drawing.
Lena returned each night. At first, the townspeople noticed her absence from the usual places. The market, the apothecary, even the little music shop that still held her favorite cello behind the counter, untouched for nearly a year. But then they began to understand, in that quiet, unspoken way small towns do. No one asked. No one intruded. They simply let the girl with the soft steps and the shadowed eyes disappear into the twilight. Each evening, just after the final bell from St. Viral's tower, she would slip into the square. She brought a different item with her each time. Once, a candle in a glass jar. Another night, a blanket he had left folded near his windowsill. And always, always, the sketchbook. She filled its pages with fragments, not only of Elian, though his face was etched there more often than not, but of fleeting things. The sway of the hawthorn's limbs in the breeze, a cat that perched sometimes on the chapel roof, her own hands, drawn again and again, trying to remember the strength they'd had when they held his. There were no words, no monologues, no bursts of sorrow, only lines, shaded and curved and tentative, some crisp, some blurred from tears she didn't remember shedding. One evening, a boy passed by and saw her sitting there. He was no older than 10, with grass-stained knees and a paper kite clutched in his fist. "Are you an artist?" he asked boldly, cocking his head at the book in her lap. Lena looked up, startled. then smiled softly. I used to be. The boy stared at the drawing of Elian's face. He looks kind. He was. Where is he? Lena looked toward the horizon, where the sun had just begun to melt into the sea, sending ribbons of copper across the sky. Far away, she said. The boy nodded solemnly, then offered her his kite. Here, you can borrow it. I bet he'd like it if you let it fly for him. She took it, surprised. Thank you. When the boy left, Lena rose and walked to the edge of the square, where the hill overlooked the shore. She held the kite into the wind, and after a few stumbles, it lifted, higher, higher still. It darted and dipped and finally steadied, red and blue and wild against the dusk. She imagined Elian seeing it. She imagined him smiling. It was late August when she returned to the coast. The cliffs rose jagged above the churning sea, and the air was thick with salt and sun. She took the train north, with nothing but a rucksack and the worn sketchbook tucked inside it. There was a spot she remembered him describing, past the 13th milepost, where the lavender grows through the rock. There's a ridge shaped like a gull's wing. That was my sky. She found it. It took hours. Stone, purple, and alive. She sat there for hours, drew the sky, drew the sea, drew the emptiness between them. When the sun touched the horizon, she pulled the final page from the sketchbook, an unfinished portrait of Elian, his eyes caught halfway between thought and laughter, and folded it gently. She placed it beneath the lavender and left it to the wind. Years passed. The seasons turned through their endless waltz, and Avienne aged as all towns do, quietly, with grace. The chapel stood still, the hawthorn tree thickened with time. New lovers came to sit beneath its branches, unaware of the stories left in the stones beneath them. And in the town's little gallery by the fountain, a room was added. Unfinished Things, read the plaque. Inside, sketches lined the walls, some sharp, others faint, all signed with a single initial, L. At the center stood a bench, aged and smooth, and a drawing on the wall above it. Soft, detailed, endless in its incompletion. A man beneath a hawthorn tree, eyes closed, smiling, waiting.